Chapter 5. As winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning, and excused herself by saying that she had overslept, and she complained of mysterious pains, although her appetite was excellent. On every kind of pretext, she would run away from work and go to the drinking pool, where she would stand foolishly gazing at her own reflection in the water. But there was also rumors of something more serious. One day, as Molly strolled blithely into the yard, flirting her long tail and chewing at a stalk of hay, Clover took her aside. "Molly," she said, "I have something very serious to say to you. This morning I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. One of the Pinkerton's men was standing on the other side of the hedge, and I was a long way away, but I am almost certain I saw this. He was talking to you, and you were allowing him to stroke your nose. What does this mean, Molly?" "He didn't. I wasn't. It isn't true," cried Molly, beginning to prance about and paw the ground. "Molly, look at me in the face. Do you give me your word of honor that the man was not stroking your nose?" "It isn't true," repeated Molly, but she could not look Clover in the face, and the next moment she took to her heels and galloped away into the field. A thought struck Clover. Without saying anything to the others, she went to Molly's stall and turned over the straw with her hoof. Hidden under the straw were a little pile of lumps of sugar and several bunches of ribbon of different colors. 3 days later, Molly disappeared. For some weeks nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeons reported that she had been seen on the other side of Willingdon. She was between the shafts of a smart dog horse, painted red and black, which was standing outside a public house. A fat, red-faced man in check breeches and gaiters, who looked like a publican, was stroking her nose and feeding her with sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore scarlet ribbon around her forelock. She appeared to be enjoying herself, so the pigeons said. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again. In January there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn, and the pigs occupied themselves with planning out the work of the coming season. It had come to be accepted that the pigs, who were manifestly cleverer than the other animals, should decide all the questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. This arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. If one of them suggested sowing a bigger acreage with barley, the other was certain to demand a bigger acreage of oats. And if one of them said that such and such a field was just right for cabbages, the other would declare that it was useless for anything except roots. Each had his own followings, and there were some violent debates. At the meetings, Snowball often would won over the majority by his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself in between times. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late the sheep had taken to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meeting with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball had made a close study of some back numbers of the farmer and stock breeders which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans of innovations and improvements. He talked learningly about field drains, silage, and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme for all the animals to drop their dung directly into the fields at different spots each day to save the labor of cartage. Napoleon produced no scheme of his own, but he said quietly that Snowball would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time. But all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture, not far from the farm building, there was a small knoll, which was the highest point in the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that it was just the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate a dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in the winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, and a mangle slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals had never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was an old-fashioned one and had only the most primitive machinery. And they listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do their work for them while they grazed at the ease of the fields, or improved their minds with reading and conversation. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books which had belonged to Mr. Jones: 1,000 Useful Things to Do About the House, Every Man His Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners. Snowball used his study as a shed, which had once been used as an incubator, and a smooth wooden floor suitable for drawing with. He was closeted there for hours at a time, with his books he held open by a stone, and with a piece of chalk gripped between the knuckles and his trotter. He would move rapidly to and fro, drawing line after line, and uttering little whimpers of excitement. Gradually the plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels, covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible, but very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came, and were at pains not to thread the chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily round the shed, looked closely at every detail of the plans, and snuffed at them once or twice, and then stood for a little while contemplating them out of the corner of his eye. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated over the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a difficult business. Stone would have to be carried and built up into the walls. Then the stalls would have to be made, and after that there would be need for dynamos and cables. How these were to be procured, Snowball did not say, but he maintained that it could be done in a year, and thereafter, he declared, so much labor would be saved that the animals would only need work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that the great need for the moment was to increase food production, and that they would wasted time on the windmill if they would all starve to death. The animals formed themselves into 2 factions under the slogan, "Vote for Snowball on the 3-day week," and "Vote for Napoleon and the full manger." Benjamin was the only animal who did not side with either faction. He refused to believe that either that the food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it has always gone on. That is, badly. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was a question of the defense of the farm. It was fully realized that though the human beings had been defeated in the Battle of Cowshed, they might take another and more determined attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighboring farms more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do is to procure firearms and train themselves to use them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up rebellion among the animals on the other farms. The one argued that if they could not defend themselves, they were bound to be conquered. The other argued that if rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened first to Napoleon and then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. At last the day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting of the following Sunday, the question to whether or not to begin work on this windmill was to be put to a vote. When the animals had assembled in the big barn, Snowball stood up, and, though occasionally interrupted by bleating from the sheep, set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense, and he had advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds, and seemed almost indifferent as to the effect he produced. As to this, Snowball sprang to his feet, and shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeals in favor of the windmill. Until now the animals had been equally divided on their sympathies, but a moment Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences he painted a picture of Animal Farm, as it might be sordid labor was lifted from the animal's back. His imagination has now run from beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, plows, harrows, rollers, and reapers and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water, and an electric heater. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt to which way the vote would go. But just at that moment, Napoleon stood up, and casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard him utter before.